Suppose you and I, excuse me, were to have a conversation about this very simple item, an apple. Suppose you and I were to talk about it. What are some of the things we might talk about? Well, we might talk about its color, the gradations of color, the size, the weight, the shape, where it came from, what kind it is, what you can do with it, the uses, the particular geometrical shape it has, and so on. And suppose, as we talk, I were to list on the board the individual things we were talking about. And then suppose I had a battery of secretaries and a battery of blackboards, and we wrote on the board all of the things we talked about, all of the uses, the great and tremendous varieties from just plain eating it to distilling it, and all of the other things that we could talk about this as the apple in song and story, the apple in that very great story. We could talk about the chemistry and the physics. And then suppose as we talked, I kept putting these items on the board. And now I'd like to come to my question. How long would we have to stay here talking about the apple until I could go to the board and draw a great big line and put a period and say, stop. That's all that could be said. Nothing more can be said about this. How long would that take us? When I ask students or audiences sometimes the answer to that question, they reply differently. Some will say forever, a very long time. We never could do it. Some will say, yes, it's possible. We can say all that can be said about this if you leave us alone and let us work on it long enough. That is, there will be a range of replies, but most of the people will tend to say something like this. They will tend to say, no, that isn't all that could be said. There's more. So in order to account for them, let me put a great big ETC and so forth, meaning more could be said. I suppose if I were to have done this little demonstration 50 years ago, or perhaps 100 years ago, the number of people in the audience who would agree with me that we haven't said all there is to be said would be far greater today than it would be then. There were loads of people in the 19th century, for example, who somehow believed, if you leave us alone, we can say all there is to be said. There were some historians, like von Ranke, who was going to write a fully developed history. There were some people in the physical sciences who somehow had come to believe that we had come to the end of what could be said about things. Just one example out of very many others. In 1873, Clerk Maxwell gave a paper to the British Association. Now, the name Clerk Maxwell is one of the brilliant names in the history of physics, and I should just like to read 2 paragraphs from that paper. He says, no theory of evolution can be formed to account for the similarity of molecules. That is, Maxwell is using the word molecule in pretty much the same sense that we today would use the word atom. He says, for evolution necessarily implies continuous change, and the molecule is incapable of growth or decay, of generation or destruction. None of the processes of nature from the time when nature began have produced the slightest difference in the properties of any molecule. We are therefore unable to ascribe either the existence of molecules or the identity of their properties to any of the causes which we call natural. Now, please note this sentence. Thus, we have been led along a strictly scientific path very near to the point at which science must stop. In tracing back the history of matter, science is arrested when she assures herself on the one hand that the molecule has been made, and on the other that it has not been made by any of the processes which we call natural. Now, in 1873, Clerk Maxwell was ready to say that when we have proceeded as far as we can, that's the point at which science must stop. Well, it's interesting that 23 years after the date of Clerk Maxwell's speech, Becquerel observed the radioactivity of uranium. Something was happening to molecules. They did change. They were generated. They were being destroyed. 25 years after Clerk Maxwell, Madame Curie discovered radium. And at the turn of the century, Rutherford and Soddy demonstrated the fact that the radium atom was in a process of rapid disintegration and was itself derived from uranium, whose atoms were disintegrating at a much slower rate. And 70 years later, the word was given to spend $2 billion on the development of a bomb whose theory was that we have not yet come to the end of what we know about the molecule. Nevertheless, it is widely believed today, and I suspect one can get a great deal of agreement, that whenever we talk about anything, probably we will not come to the end of what could be said about it. That when we finish, we perhaps will put a great big comma and et cetera to mean or to imply that more can be said. Now, of course, this isn't anything new. Loads of people have realized this. Thoreau, in his Walden, wrote, "The universe is wider than our views of it." And Walter de la Mare, the poet, wrote, "What we see and hear is only the smallest fraction of what is." And George Santayana wrote, "The most exhaustive account which human science can ever give of anything does not cover all that is true about it." And I even note that William James said, "The word 'and' trails along after every sentence, something always escapes." And to complete this list, to remember that Hamlet at one point turns and says, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamed on in our philosophy." So I like the way that wag said it, who, while working on his grapefruit, "There's more in this than meets the eye." That is to say, the world in which we live is a big one. It's full of innumerable details. We talk about the apple, and the number of details and aspects and factors and characteristics that we can talk about, that number is tremendous. I'm almost unwilling to say that it's infinite, but it's tremendous. So that whenever we talk about anything, what must we do, if this is true? If someone were to give a talk about the apple, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, 100-minute talk, what would he do? He would select some things to talk about, and he would omit the remainder. Thus, fundamental in the human talking process is that we abstract, we take out of the great number some and omit the remainder. We select some and omit everything that we don't select. And I should like to suggest that this is what talking is like. One can't possibly talk about everything. One can't possibly, I now think, say everything there is to be said about anything. So what does one do? He selects some of the details and omits the remainder. Now, why, if we were to give an assignment, say, to a dozen people to talk about the apple, why, in all probability, would each talk about different aspects of the apple? Well, our psychology friends have all sorts of explanations. You select some things to talk about, you others, based on your conditioning, your experience, your capacity. I think the broad word interest, the things that interest you, are the things which will determine what you select.